So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to session 2. Before we start, I want to start with 2 simple questions. And please participate, or else this is just going to be really awkward and me staring at you. Since you woke up this morning, how many of you have used electricity? Okay. And since you woke up this morning, how many of you have used internet? Okay. So it seemed like all of you raised your hands. And if anyone up in the balcony who I can't see didn't, you're a liar. Now, I will say I am not a statistician, and I don't know if this is a random sample of the DC Metro, but I think everyone in this room could agree that this room is pretty representative of those of us who live in Washington, D.C., Virginia, Maryland, sort of the mid-Atlantic region. And all of us wake up every day with electricity and internet quite literally at our fingertips. And I think if that internet suddenly went away, none of us would know what to do. But what if I told you high-speed internet at your fingertips isn't a reality for 25 million Americans across the country, 7% of the United States population? And what if I told you, as we traversed into the sort of western parts of this map, that percentage went up to 43% of rural Americans who don't have access to high-speed internet? It's astounding. But to understand how we got to this point, we need to talk about the first wires that ever came into American homes: electricity. So travel with me, if you will, back to the 1920s. We'd be sitting here in Gaston Hall, probably under some newly installed electric lamps, looking at the wonderful decorations around us and the really attractive speaker on stage. But the reason we would have electricity is because Washington, D.C., as you can tell from this map, was at the forefront of American electrification. D.C. first came online in 1910 when the Capitol Power Plant was fired up just outside of the U.S. Capitol. And we remained at the forefront all the way up into the modern age. But as you can see from this map, the vast majority of states, really west of Pennsylvania and Virginia, were not using electricity at levels even close to the East Coast. And you may be thinking to yourself, why is that? But honestly, the answer is pretty simple. It's because our population looked like this in 1920. All of these empty areas on the map, the more white they get, the lower the population density is, were looked at by the big electric companies of the time, and were simply told, there's no money there. So we aren't going to waste time and waste capital in electrifying 1 or 2 homes every 5 or 10 miles, simply so that everyone can have the luxury of electricity. They said, we're going to lose money, so it's not worth it. In this map, only 6% of Americans have access to electricity. And they ruled out 94% of people and said, it's just not worth it. But these communities looked at each other, and they said, we need this. We need lights. We need heat. We need the modern amenities of the 20th century. And a lot of people started to ask, why isn't the government doing anything about this? But in 1936, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as president, signed the Rural Electrification Act and created an agency under the Department of Agriculture to unlock millions of federal dollars and sort of serve as a catalyst for the electrification of rural America. And as you can see from this advertisement, this was now turned into a nationwide campaign to bring every home in the United States onto the electric grid. However, as private companies often do, they looked at this federal money and said, it's really still not worth our time. We aren't going to get subscribers in rural Kansas. Nobody in New Mexico really cares about electricity, so we're just going to ignore the money. And these communities had to decide then and there, if nobody was going to turn the lights on for them, they were going to have to do it themselves. And from the 1930s through the 1950s, these communities turned to their neighbors and they said, fine, we are going to create the nation's first rural cooperatives to create our own power plants, to run our own electric lines, and bring our homes fully into the 20th century. However, again, as private companies usually do, they looked at this and they said, hold on. They went to members of Congress and senators and they said, the government shouldn't get to compete with private companies. That's not how capitalism works. They went to these members of Congress and they said, electricity is a luxury. I mean, who really needs heat and lights anyway, right? And they said, tax dollars shouldn't be going to this issue. We have all these other problems in the United States. Why aren't we addressing them? And these rural cooperatives had to fight back, luckily with the assistance of FDR, to look at these private companies and say, you left us behind. You gave us no other option, so we did it ourselves. And I can luckily say now, in 2019, 1 in 7 American homes are electrified by a co-op or a publicly owned electric company. And you can see just how intricate our electric grid is now today. And that is not at the hands of private companies solely. That is because citizens who were fed up stood up and said it's our time to be put on the electric grid too. But some of you are starting to glaze over a little bit. I know this sounds like an electricity history lesson, and you're probably like, I'm at a TED Talk. Why am I getting a lecture from day 1 of undergrad? We will go back to 2019 for your sake. And I want to bring you back to my point from earlier. 25 million Americans don't have internet access. And those are the people we're going to talk about today. But the sad fact is, if I wanted to tell you their story, I could quite literally restart my PowerPoint, and the maps would be the same. The arguments would be the same. The lack of action from private companies would be exactly the same. And 25 million Americans were ruled out unilaterally by 5 or 6 internet CEOs sitting at the top. And these aren't just people who want to watch Netflix or Hulu or go on Amazon. These are millions of educators who are worried that their students simply aren't going to be able to do their homework at night. These are millions of small business owners who will never be able to expand beyond their brick-and-mortar stores. And these are millions of medical patients and rural doctors who will never know about the up-and-coming cures or treatments for different diseases and are simply left wondering, what are we going to do about it? But just like their predecessors, they have stood up and said, if nobody is going to turn the internet on for me, we are simply going to have to do it ourselves. Because these people aren't fighting for luxury like those at the top want you to believe. They are simply fighting for the right to live. To start with this story, I want to tell you about a cute little town in Tennessee. The town is Chattanooga. As you can probably assume, in 2009, Chattanooga looked at their current internet situation and they said, it sucks. So what are we going to do about it? Their city council came together and started to talk to citizens, and they developed the solution of a city-owned and operated internet network. Chattanooga already owned their electric utility, and they said, we own the wires, we already have meters on people's homes, let's act on this and bring internet to every single home in Chattanooga. They started to roll out EPB Fiber Optics, their internet company, and were on path to deploy gigabit speeds to every single home in Chattanooga. But just like the electric predecessors did 100 years prior, the internet companies looked at this, and they turned to Congress, and they turned to the state of Tennessee, and they said, hold on, this isn't capitalism. Why is the city getting to do this when that's my market? Now, it was their market they were forgetting about, but they claimed it was their market nonetheless. And the incumbent internet providers went to the Tennessee state legislature, backed with millions of dollars in lobbying funds, and they convinced the state of Tennessee to ban city-owned and operated internet networks so that there wouldn't be government competition in what they thought should be a private-only market. At the same time, a fight was ensuing in Washington, D.C., where the Federal Communications Commission tried to step in on behalf of Chattanooga and say, yes, this is innovation. This is what America is. This is bringing people online. But once again, the private companies took the FCC to court, and U.S. federal courts ruled that the federal government no longer had a role in the active deployment of internet to its citizens. So the city of Chattanooga was left to fight on its own, not only against their own state government, but against multimillionaires running giant corporations that span the world. I will tell you, though, after 5 lawsuits filed against the city of Chattanooga, they were eventually successful, and to this day operate the fastest city-owned and operated network in the country. To say that Chattanooga was an underdog is a vastly understatement of their situation. A good comparison in my mind was the probability of UVA winning March Madness this past spring. But just like my alma mater, Chattanooga was also successful against all odds. But Chattanooga isn't the only city taking place in this fight. I also want to take the last couple minutes of my speech to tell you about Fort Collins, Colorado, another quaint, beautiful mountain town. And in 2017, Fort Collins said, we're sick of our internet speeds. We're sick of our citizens being ripped off, terrible internet companies simply not doing what we need in 2017. So they started to talk to their citizens in their community, and they said, how would you all feel about a public internet company? How would you feel if we rolled out fiber optic cables to your home and you paid a city utility just like you do with water and sewer and electricity? But Comcast and CenturyLink, the incumbent internet providers at the time, knew they had to start fighting much earlier in order to win this fight. So almost immediately after the rumblings started in Fort Collins for a city-owned network, Comcast and CenturyLink pumped money into this advertisement that played for the community.
I love Fort Collins, and things are really moving.
But that usually means traffic isn't.
Instead of focusing on this, the city wants to get into the internet business.
Measure 2B would spend $150 million on a broadband network, with no plan for how to do it.
And if it loses money, our electricity bills could go up.
Instead, we should invest in public safety.
Affordable housing!
And roads and bridges!
Vote no on 2B.
Because the internet won't speed this up.
They were trying to convince citizens once again that taxpayer dollars should not be wasted on internet, that there are other issues in the community that need to be addressed. And I'm not saying today that affordable housing and infrastructure and public safety aren't important, but why is it that internet was ruled out as a luxury? Who made that decision? It was the people at the top. Over the course of the campaign in Fort Collins, Comcast and CenturyLink spent a combined $900,000 to fight the measure. Mind you, that was $1 million they could have been investing in their customers to solve the problem in Fort Collins. But instead, they saw what they thought was unfair competition and pumped all of this money into it. Eventually, I will say Fort Collins did win their referendum vote. And when it came down to the tally, for every vote that Comcast and CenturyLink received against the referendum, they spent $55 to buy that vote. Meanwhile, the grassroots efforts pushing for the city-owned network only spent 70 cents per vote. Even as we sit here today, Fort Collins is being led by a plethora of advocates who are quite literally laying this fiber optic cable with their own two hands into every home in Fort Collins because they realized 2019 is 2 decades too late for a town to come online. And they deleted one of my slides. You may be thinking to yourself, why does this matter, Lucas? You're telling me about this small town in Colorado, this small town in Tennessee. This isn't really relevant to me. When the speech is over, I'm going to take my phone back out, connect to the shoddy Georgetown Wi-Fi that sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. But I'm going to tweet about the fact that I'm here. I'm going to post a picture from last night, respond to my Snapchats, check my 5 email accounts. I'm going to do all of this from the comfort of the chair that I'm in right now. And when I go home, I'm going to stream Netflix, and this really doesn't matter to me. But that's why I'm talking to you all today. Because these people have been resisting since the dot-com boom in the 1990s, since they realized that big cities and urban centers were getting something that they would never get. They were electrified because the government stepped in, and they can use those lights to see around their home, yes, but they don't have the internet access to see around their world. All of us in this room have the power to step up and to be aware of these ideas. I'm not here to shame you and say, wow, how did you miss this for the last 20 years? How did you not know this was happening? That's just a matter of life in the United States. We focus on us and us alone. But I tell you this because we have 25 million people, our neighbors, who are going home tonight. And not only will they not be able to stream Netflix and Hulu, but they're not going to be able to search for a new job to support their family. A student, someone much younger than all of us, is not going to be able to go home and do his book report or her book report because she's simply not going to be able to get online. These families don't know what they're missing, but we need to make sure they enter the digital age with us. I hope all of you leave this room with a little extra knowledge about the privilege we hold as internet users, and that all of us come together and over the next 5, 10, hopefully it doesn't take 15 years, but who knows, that we will see more and more communities come online through their own work and their own initiatives, and one day we can see more of these ads published like Longmont, Colorado did when they defeated Comcast in their referendum to create a city-owned network. And we can look at all of the big internet companies who think that they can decide who comes online and who doesn't, and we can tell them, no, this is our fight, and if you aren't going to do it for us, we'll do it for ourselves. Thank you.